How's New Jersey?
She's doing well. We found some water in a stateroom because of the heavy rains last week or earlier this week. Maintenance is looking into it today, so I'll be interested to hear where that came from. It's almost certainly a deck drain.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, welcome back. Let's see here. For you at home, it'll have been a month. For us, it's been 3 minutes.
We're time travelers.
So welcome back to this episode of the Portholes podcast. We're going to talk Battleship today, but nothing too crazy. We're gonna tackle the all important question of what's your favorite battleship. Now, that might be an obvious question to a certain somebody, but I've instructed Ryan he is not allowed to say New Jersey. So if you want to find out what Ryan's not really favorite battleship but is, then stay tuned. We'll be right back. Okay, Ryan, it's time to serious up. But not really.
Do you have a definition for favorite? Which one do I think is best? Or
Sure. So we're going to break this into two parts here. You're not allowed to say New Jersey because that's cheating. And if you want to break it up between USN and everyone else. And let's keep it like the interwar through World War II, obviously.
Not go back to pre-dreadnought.
Yeah. Like, no dreadnought and, whatever. You can't say Virginia because of the 8-inch turret welded on top of it. Well, you can't. Okay. It's not even a turret at that point. It's just a mount. So, would you like to go first, or do you want me to go first? Do you want more time to think?
I have some battleships that are very special to me.
Okay.
I don't think I have a favorite.
Mm-hmm.
I love studying them all. And when I was playing with toy boats as a kid, oftentimes I would build my own out of Legos or wood or whatever, cardboard, because the perfect battleship was never built, or at least what I thought was the perfect battleship.
That's obviously not Montana. No.
She gets closer than many, but
okay.
Not quite.
Sure.
Maybe somewhere along her lineage.
Somewhere in there.
Is pretty close. So some of the battleships that are really special to me would, of course, be Arizona. It was a model of Arizona that my dad had built when I was 4 years old. I climbed up on the shelf and I pulled down, and that was where my obsession with battleships started. So there's, of course, a special place in my heart for that ship. Was it a good ship or a perfect ship? Horribly slow, like dump truck dimensions on that thing. Not the greatest wartime record.
Unfortunately, when you compare, obviously Arizona's sister Pennsylvania goes on and has a World War II career and serves throughout and
does yeoman's work.
Does a good job. So then you say, well, Arizona then is really only famous for a couple seconds worth of newsreel footage that we're all very familiar with. So that's a fair answer.
But she is where my concept of the battleship comes from. Those big guns, fore and aft, that dominate the profile of the ship. That stately look. As there's a footage of one of the standard type battleships sailing into Pearl Harbor, I think with a palm tree there. And just the most stately thing you can think of, with those tall tripod masts balancing each other out fore and aft. And that has captivated me in a way that here I am 29 years later. It hasn't worn off. I've made it into a career. So Arizona is certainly special. My parents noticed that and nurtured it. My dad didn't want me to break his plastic model of Arizona, so he made me a wooden one, which I still have. He said it was from Santa Claus. I found out a few years later that was not the case.
Good old dad. Yeah. Well, I have a very similar story too. Is that so? My father has a Missouri, BB-63, the Iowa model in our basement, and that had been there forever. It's just kind of floated around in various places. But that was sort of my first experience with being able to see it in a model form versus maybe seeing something on television. And so the Iowas for me are my first touch point, and actually New Jersey was my first battleship. I want to say also museum ship, but I can't say for certain. I'd have to go back and ask, but that's the New Jersey 2003. So I was 10. New Jersey is like my first battleship museum, and that's just sort of resonates with me. And then it's just kind of funny that then 15 years later you and I meet, and I'm like, oh, okay.
Well, I mean, speaking of stately and impressive looking, the lines of the Iowa class have never been matched.
No, absolutely not.
You were doomed.
I know, doomed. Now, because
what was your dad thinking, keeping something like that in the house?
Because I am
very addictive.
Because I am not New Jersey's curator, I can say that New Jersey is my favorite U.S. battleship. Keeping to Ryan's the rules that I have put on Ryan, if I had to pick something that wasn't an Iowa class, I would go with Washington, North Carolina's sister. The battle with Kirishima and Admiral Lee, and there's just something really special there, and not many warships, especially battleships, and especially in World War II, get to claim that they entered in a gunnery duel with another ship of like that sort of type. Obviously, we can talk about Congos, what they are by World War II. They're more like battle cruisers, but still, though, it is really epic, and I do love the fact that Admiral Lee works with the captain and the crew so closely, and just they really dial it in, and it just goes to show you it's like you have the crew sort of the men and the machinery working together to make, and of course Washington and North Carolina are the U.S.'s first battleships in a long time, and so they have this long trial period, even longer than the South Dakotas and the Iowas, as they're trying to figure out what these ships are good at and what they're not so good at, and
they're a complete break with the mold from previous battleships, and they set up the later classes of battleships, and it's not a bad break. They're certainly flawed ships, but it is not a bad break from the mold, and absolutely gorgeous ships with great histories, both of them.
You're right, and ultimately, I'm disappointed that the state of Washington didn't want their battleship. You think that would be a no-brainer, given the fact that it's a coast city, and you would have a battleship on the West Coast, which Missouri is in Hawaii, but doesn't really count. Mainland West Coast. Well, I'm sorry. Iowa.
She comes around much, much later.
Yeah.
We're talking about the early 60s when Washington would have been available.
Exactly.
Which is a full 50 years before they actually get a museum battleship there.
Exactly. You're right. So,
forget cultural significance, forget preserving history, just the economic impact that having this ready-made museum dropped in your state, like the tourism that you're going to generate.
And especially in the immediate post-war years where the veterans from the ship go back and visit like right away, versus trying to build new interest in younger generations.
You've got Puget Sound there. You've got the experience to maintain it, and you've got a fair number of ship people, former crew members of ships like this, or at least the guys who worked on them every time they came into the yard, are there. They're interested in it.
And even from a maintenance standpoint, like even today, if Washington was somewhere up there, it's not a far journey to Bremerton or somewhere potentially where you could, put the ship into dry dock. And it seems to me like it was an unfortunate waste. And it could have been something fairly interesting.
For sure. And nowadays you could say, oh, there's too many museum ships, or they're on top of each other. Certainly here on the East Coast you can say that. But in the 60s or 70s and on the West Coast, certainly not. There is a market there that still to this day hasn't been tapped.
Yeah, it really is unfortunate. So are you going with Arizona? Or do you have, or is that an asterisk and you'd like to throw another ship in the mix?
There is one other battleship that is special to me from my childhood, and that would be Massachusetts. She was my first museum battleship, probably about 2 years after I got into battleships. My parents had a timeshare, and they got a place up in, I can't remember now. Forgive me, it's been 25 years.
You're forgiven.
Somewhere up in Massachusetts, and they decided to drive down to Battleship Cove and take my brother and I to spend the day there on the whole collection they have. So I honestly can't remember if those were my first museum ships or if I made it on the ones in Baltimore earlier, or if that was both my first battleship and my first collection of museum ships. But certainly a special place in my heart. Holding the model is one thing. Moving it around the floor and having it fight my dad's Bismarck model or whatever else the case may have been. And watching the documentaries is one thing. But the first time you see one up close and it's just towering above you, the first time you walk on one, feel the steel, smell that smell that they all have on the inside.
Which I think is like permanently leached into you. It's like you would have to be retired for years before like you finally give that up.
I use Bunker C as deodorant.
Bunker C, okay, yeah, that makes perfect sense. One of the things about Massachusetts, which I think really is interesting, is obviously it's involved in torch and it takes shore battery fire. Is that you can see they've preserved like the damage. And they've filled it in with fragments, and you can see the battle damage, and obviously where it was repaired and stuff like that. But that ship represents this is a battleship. Like this took shell fire, and this shell went through this deck and did this and exploded in this room, and you can, and then they display that and you can see it, and here's this gigantic patch, and then here you go, and it really sort of completes the idea that this is a warship. This is a fighting. This is meant for battle, and the idea that it took damage and then doled it back out. And obviously, they have the shell from when digging it out of Jean Bart, and so that ship is really unique and really interesting. Something that you don't get on the like the Iowas, and they don't really take shell fire in that regard, or at least I know there's
they've all taken a hit at some point.
Correct.
Like New Jersey took a hit on the faceplate of her turret, did no damage. Iowa likewise took a hit on her turret. You might be able to see a scratch on her. Missouri was hit by a phalanx round. You go somewhere you can see like a 20 millimeter hole through a pipe in the 01 level, the superstructure. Wow.
Yeah. But I mean, so exactly. I'm not saying that they never took any sort of hits, but I think just the representation on Massachusetts, I think it's more visual and you can see it, and I think it just makes the experience a little bit more real.
Yeah, in last episode we were talking about modifying your museum ship and how far is allowed. Like obviously they wouldn't have highlighted that during the rest of the ship's service. It would have all been painted whatever the other interior color was. So it was the museum that decides to go back and paint it and really highlight that. And we were both unsure where we were on the spectrum of modifying a ship. But I think you'll agree with me that is like well within the acceptable.
Well, because the damage is not only a part of the art, like the artifact is damaged.
Yeah.
But that damage is a large part of the ship's story. I mean, the ship is brand new and they sail it to North Africa, and you engage with, albeit Jean Bart is stationary, but that's still two battleships hurling shells at each other,
which was a very rare thing.
So that's it's certainly a part of the ship's history, and I'm not only glad that they found the shell fragment, but then it's available on board, and then you see the splinter damage and everything. It's wonderful. So Massachusetts is definitely high on that list.
I don't remember what it's called, but there's a Japanese, I'm not sure if you'd call it an art form or tradition of when you fix something that was broken.
Yes.
You highlight that break. And oftentimes
with the gold, with the gold paint.
Exactly. Exactly. And I feel like that's what they did.
So by painting all the fragments red, and then it just really highlights it nicely. No, absolutely. Yeah.
What a compelling educational tool.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Now, the one thing I will say about the South Dakotas is that after having the luxury of touring and spending a lot of time on Iowas, when you walk down the pier, when you walk up to a South Dakota, you're like, where's the other 25%? Because it's like you're like
accordion battleships. Everything that you would have on an Iowa is just compressed,
and then
into 3/4 the size. Even compared to a North Carolina, they're compressed.
Yeah. No, exactly. Yeah, South Dakota is shorter than North Carolina. The treaty era was very interesting.
Wild times. Put all the guns at the bow, or just shrink the size of the armored citadel.
Yeah, exactly. But they're all very unique and interesting, and I'm glad that they're at least still around.
And perhaps the most important part about them is they have touched lives. Whether it was the guys who called those ships their homes, it was the guys who they saved by providing shore bombardment support during the war, or counter battery fire against Jean Bart, other instances, or the people like you and I who have been irrevocably altered by getting the chance to experience these ships. That they were designed to last for a very finite period of time, and they certainly impacted lives then, but they've impacted so many more since we've preserved them as museums.
Absolutely. So let's touch on part 2, but also what you just said. If you could pick an Axis battleship, or not Axis, any other nation in the World War II period, so that includes allies, so not necessarily Axis. If you could pick any battleship as a museum ship in its home country today, what would it be?
So that's a slightly different question than which one would be my favorite.
It is, but since we're talking about museum ships, I feel like maybe we should alter that. Okay, answer it in 2 parts then. If you have a favorite, fine, and then maybe a museum.
Do I have to limit it to one?
No. You didn't limit your USN choice to one.
That's true. That's true. Let's see. I think the scrapping of Warspite was the biggest tragedy.
Oh, absolutely.
If any ship anywhere in the world deserved to be kept as a museum, it was that one. And so
right.
The way you phrased it, which one should have been stayed as a museum ship? Warspite. Every single time, Warspite.
So not only do I agree with that, that's not my pick, but I will 100% agree with that. And even after, so if Warspite is not kept, I think that the scrapping of Vanguard is also a travesty.
Because the last one that they had.
Vanguard is like this greatest hits of British battleship. It's long and kind of thin, kind of
very battlecruiser-esque.
And then it mounts the 15-inch guns, which are pulled out of storage. So that gives you sort of the Warspite feel.
And very much the best of the British battleship weapons.
But then it's also got the modern sort of tower superstructure, which all of the British battleships sort of kind of would have had. If like the later ones would have been built,
including your battleship killers, King George V and Duke of York.
So Warspite and then Vanguard. But Vanguard is like, again, this greatest hits, And so when you scrap Warspite, like with the actual career, and then you get rid of Vanguard, it's like, come on.
You have lost that tangible physical connection to your maritime history. Oh, great, her bell or whatever is in a museum, or one of her gun barrels laying on the lawn. Cool, that's an artifact you can walk up to and look at. But you had the chance to be able to go inside and experience this thing the way that generations of Englishmen experienced the ships that made England a dominant empire. And they cut it up for razor blades.
And I know that obviously the economic situation in the UK was not good, post-war. Obviously, there's a lot of debt, a lot of things that have to be paid back. But I really think that if at least one of them, doesn't matter which one, had been preserved, it would have been at least profitable. It's hard. Obviously, you don't know, but at the same time, it's in 2023. It's really hard to think about that.
Keeps me up at night.
So, what's your favorite So if that's the museum answer, then what's your favorite non-US battleship?
Maybe a little bit controversial.
Okay.
In that I'm calling her a battleship.
Okay.
The Mighty Ood.
Oh, okay. Fair. So you've gone with a Royal Navy, and both answer. Okay.
Which isn't to say that I don't love these other countries' ships. I would have loved to have seen one of the Littorios preserved. Like, if you've ever seen pictures of the inside of them, it's like walking onto the set of a live-action Jetsons movie. Like, what great-looking ships those were, and active careers. The German battleships, of course, if any of them could have survived.
Also, now you're walking on my answer.
Yeah.
So for me, the answer is both parts of that question are the same ship, and that's going to be Tirpitz.
Okay. Tirpitz and not Bismarck.
Correct. Bismarck, obviously, we're going to do an episode on that here eventually. But obviously, the Bismarck story, really well known. The ship is in service for like a week, gets sunk, and it's in popular culture and everything else like that. Tirpitz is this interesting story as a ship that it's like, oh, well, of course, after Bismarck is lost, that's when surface ships of the, Kriegsmarine like start to lose favor, Raider is disgraced, all this other stuff. And so I don't think Tirpitz gets the time to shine that she could have had. I say she, Tirpitz. Tirpitz is feminine pronouns here, unlike her brother, Bismarck. That's
her older brother.
And obviously, Tirpitz goes north and kind of goes out and shoots off some rounds, and then goes and hides in some fjords, and then gets tallboyed.
Yeah, even her nickname is feminine pronouns, the Lonely Queen of the North.
Right, and that's how I always remember it. Her brother is the Iron Chancellor, and then Bismarck, and then she is the Lonely Queen of the North. And there's something about that. Obviously, the ship's career is not very spectacular, but it's that just her presence. And the fact that she's there and can come out, and the Churchill's craze, like I need that thing gone, so just throw everything at it to the point where we develop the largest non-nuclear bomb in history, and drop a bunch, and it still takes a couple hits to actually sink Tirpitz. But why Tirpitz over Bismarck? But so Bismarck to me is the like OEM like out of the factory stock, like just barely finished, and then gets sunk. But then Tirpitz undergoes the refits and the modifications that battleships, especially in the U.S. Navy, underwent during World War II. Like so North Carolina comes out with 50 caliber machine guns and 1.1 and all this other junk, and then by the end of the war, just like every other ship, she's covered in 40 millimeter and 20 millimeter, and so Tirpitz undergoes sort of the same modifications. So her superstructure is built out a little bit. We get more 20 millimeter and in the form of single, twin, quad flak veerlings, and then you get like 37 millimeter, so that the anti-aircraft battery is built up, and the stations that those mounts are bolted to gets built up.
Yeah.
So she undergoes this sort of and thus becomes heavier than her brother.
The heaviest European battleship ever.
So then Tirpitz becomes the heaviest European battleship ever. And then she gets torpedo tubes from the from cruiser Nuremberg, I believe, or
one of
Königsberg,
those.
they a set of torpedo tubes get taken off a cruiser, and it's like, oh well, this is in stock now. Let's just bolt it on the battleship in case some British destroyers come flying down the fjord. We can just launch those off too. So not only physically different, but then the camouflage. Tirpitz goes, has a few different camouflage patterns as she's being moved around these different fjords, and I think the ship is just gorgeous. Not only the lines of the Bismarck class, but the camouflage. And one of my biggest things that I really do love about museum ships is when they're presented in these camouflage patterns.
Yeah.
So like North Carolina is particularly attractive to me because she's presented in those colors. And imagine seeing Tirpitz today as she was in like 44, 45, in one of those Norwegian fjord camos. To me, I think that would be like now, of course, politically, that would never happen. This is impossible. Not only would the ships, hypothetically, had Tirpitz survived the war, like Prince Eugen, she would have been nuked, and that would have been the end of that.
Or like Nagato. We haven't mentioned any of the great Japanese battleships. A huge loss with Nagato being sunk.
Exactly. And so obviously that never would have happened, but this is a hypothetical question anyway. But for me, that would be sort of the ultimate, is to see Tirpitz in the late war configuration, and just to see, because we'll discuss this in the Bismarck video, but those ships are like Iowa. They have sort of that same presence. They're the same relative size and weight and everything, and
the same smooth curving lines that just show speed and power.
Yeah, they're just to me they're just very pretty, and it's unfortunate. Part of me takes some. I'm like, well, okay, the ship doesn't exist, but like Prince Eugen, which we'll get to in another episode, that's still technically out of the water sometimes.
Part of her
is, and like Tirpitz, bits and pieces of it are still sitting on the bottom of that fjord. They didn't bring everything up, so it's like. Some of those ships still exist, Blucher is still down there leaking. But anyway, we're not going to get into a German Navy debate. But anyway, we're gonna end this one here. But thanks, Ryan. This was a fun one. Do tell us in the comments what your favorite battleship is, and maybe one that you would like to have seen preserved.
I'd love to hear stories from you guys about how you got interested in this, which ones were formative for you.
Mm-hmm. And make sure you like and subscribe. Like I said, we do this about once a month, and we hope to see you again on the next one. All right. Thanks, everyone.